I wrote a book on the subject woke, a subject that's been bothering me for quite some years. It started out as a lecture that I gave at every university in Flanders, because woke started at the American universities. I thought this is a logical place to give a counter message. And that lecture was very critically received in the progressive, what we call quality media of our country. And the main message in those articles was this lecture is actually about nothing. He lectures about a problem that he has invented. So that bothered me. So I used the Christmas vacation to write the lecture out in a book that has been published 10 weeks ago. And since then it is the #1 seller. So a book about nothing that sells very well, that's rather strange that so many people want to read a book that has no subject. Since then I'm regularly invited to give interviews on the subject, and the very first question every time is, what is woke? Always. Explain to us what is woke. And very often you hear in the undertone, it doesn't exist. And if it exists, if you can give examples of very flagrant examples of what woke is, they say, well, that's a byproduct of normal emancipation movements. Probably if you would have lived in the time of women's suffrage, you would have called that woke. Or the social movement of laborers in the 19th century, you would have called that woke. Or even the Flemish movement for language rights in your own country, you would have called that, you would probably be against that in that time. And now you're against, of course, the rights that are claimed by minority groups in society. You use woke just to be a conservative who wants to defend his own domination of society. That's the most common reaction you get. So maybe to be very clear for those who don't know me very well, I am all for progress. I'm convinced that freedom and equality in the right metaphysical framework will lead to the promotion of gay rights, will lead to more respect for people with a different sexual identity. It will promote women's rights, and it will promote inclusion, and it will underpin the fact that inclusion is, of course, something that the dominating group has to organize. I'm well aware that some groups in our society need to get a lot more chances from society to get equal chances in society. I'm all for that. But it's becoming very difficult to be on the right side of history in these questions, because progressive media have promoted the idea that the only problem in the polarization we're living through is the extreme right. It's a very strange polarization. Normally, if you have polarization, there must be two sides. It always takes two to tango. In this polarization, there's only one side. It's extreme right. That's polarizing against normality. There is nothing fueling extreme right. It's fueling itself just by combating normality, combating progress, civilization. So you're either on the right side of history or you're extreme right. That's about it. So if you're critical, like I'm very critical of the woke movement, the usual reaction, even if you're making quite rational and solid points, is, well, okay, maybe you're right on some things, but shut up, please. Because what you are saying will eventually promote the extreme right. And you're on the wrong side of history. You've heard that before, certainly as an argument against our party. You're on the wrong side of, if you're critical, you're on the wrong side of history. There's only one right side of history, and that's the woke side, because woke is actually the normal progress of civilization and emancipation. I don't think this is true. This is something I try to explain in my book. I think that there is a clear rupture. Woke makes a postmodernity, postmodern thinking and wokeism makes a clear rupture with modernity. Woke is a child of the postmodern way of thinking, a philosophy that became very dominant in the Western intellectual culture since the 1970s. It spread from France. Michel Foucault's very well known as one of the fathers of postmodern thinking. And this way of thinking became very, very dominant in the intellectual culture at the universities and in cultural life. It became almost for 100% the way people think. Certainly the people who articulate opinions. You have others, but usually they are not that outspoken, and they know why. Because if you speak out against this dominating way of thinking, you're cancelled or you're cast aside, you're put on the wrong side of history, and that's a bad place to be if you want to make your life in at a university, your career, or if you want to make your career in cultural life. You don't want to get caught at the wrong side of history. You'll be cancelled, and your career will be very, very short. And that domination, of course, created a vacuum. Postmodern thinking essentially robs our respublica, our society, samenleving, as we say in Dutch, living together. It's a word in Dutch that says it all. Samenleving, society is literally translated in English. It's a living together that needs glue. It needs a metaphysical framework, and postmodernity attacks that metaphysical framework from the idea that at the end of the road, every framework is constructed by powerful people to oppress less powerful people, to say how they should live, to put norms and at the end of the day discriminate minority groups. And as Foucault or Verhofstadt once said it very clearly, if you have a national identity, at the end of the road there's Auschwitz. You can't put it any clearer than that. If you daydream of a world wherein everybody will become a global citizen and live as the measure of himself, and every individual is the measure of his own existence. That has created a vacuum, and that vacuum, I see woke as a movement that filled up the vacuum, and it's a very logical filling up they did, because if you say that Western identity, Western civilization is in essence a construct of powerful people to oppress less powerful people, then Western civilization is the beginning of every problem in the world. So it's very logical, next step, woke, maybe the end of Western civilization will be the beginning of every solution that the world needs. And that's what we've seen growing at university campuses in America. It has polarized American politics up till the point that it's getting that the United States of America look more like the divided States of America, and nothing can get they have lost their capacity as a nation to stand united. And so saying this is not an important problem is really denying reality, because, of course, I see exactly the same tendencies in the European political scene. Europe is very different from the United States, but you see the same tendencies and you see the same threats. Woke will not lead us to a new synthesis. It is not a constructive movement. It is a destructive movement. It is a vengeful and bitter movement. And it will destroy our past. That is an obsession of postmodern woke thinking. Everything in our past is like a black mirror. If you look behind us, all we can see is oppression, slavery, capitalism destroying the world, Western society that has done everything wrong. Everything was wrong. Our religion was wrong. Our identity was wrong. Everything we did in the world was basically wrong. And we have to, as Mr. Infantino once put it, who is the president of the European Soccer League, we'll have to say sorry for 3,000 years in the future, for the 3,000 years that of our history, before we can be critical about anybody outside Europe. That about says it all. So they attack the past. And why is that an obsession? Because if you want to destroy a building, it's always very smart to start in the cellar, the fundamentals. If you can destroy the fundamentals, the rest will collapse. And the rest is, of course, our identity. The essence of the attack on our past is the attack on our presence, on the idea that we are still a respublica. We are a samenleving. That is what they want to destroy. And certainly in Flanders, this has taken the form of what I would call auto-racism. I have no other word for it. If you look at the reactions in academic circles on a television series we'd had, Het Verhaal van Vlaanderen, where our public network made 8 episodes on the history of Flanders, very popularizing history of Flanders. They thought that was awful. It was North Korean propaganda television, the idea that you can tell people that they have a story. The literal translation of the title is The Story of Flanders. It bothered them, 2 things bothered them enormously. Even before the first episode was aired, the criticism in the media was overwhelming. The first thing that bothered them is story. That's what they don't like, a story, a narrative. Something you can believe in, something you can pass on, something that can create synthesis. And the second word is, of course, Flanders. Because if you say that Flanders has a story, then Flanders exists. And that's just what they don't want. They attack the past, they attack our identity. I've passed the 10 minutes, but I promise you I'll be very brief. They attack the idea of equality and freedom. Equality and freedom are our basic software since the French Revolution. These are the basic values that drive our civilization. But I think they only can function if they're in a metaphysical framework. Absolute freedom does not lead to equality. That's the right of the strongest. Freedom and equality have to be in a metaphysical framework. And if you attack that framework, then freedom becomes the enemy. And equality does not become the product of freedom, the freedom that was granted us as citizens in the 19th century to work towards equality. And so many movements have done it. Women's rights movements, labor rights movements, language movements. Under the cupola of the freedom that we got of citizens, we are protected against the state, the oppression of the state. Generations has fought towards equality. This has changed. Freedom now is the enemy because it's an instrument of the dominating class, and equality has become a kind of revenge that has to be granted to all sorts of minority groups that are treated as victims. Because this is very ironic. The one thing they do not grant the Res Publica, identity, is almost forced upon the minority groups. They have an identity, the victim identity. And people are reduced to that aspect of their individuality. Certainly, if you have the unfortune of being a person of color and a woman, I think you are heterosexual, so that bad luck for you. If you wouldn't have been, then you have you tick 3 boxes, intersectional thinking, then you become the ultimate victim. And then the rest of your life you can spend in a safe space where nothing can be said that might offend you, and everything that is said to you can be offensive. Because no longer the message of our words, our intention is important. It is the perception that becomes important. And every outrage of a victim group is automatically granted, whatever your intentions may have been. So speaking out in public becomes a minefield. Whatever you can say becomes the smallest word or even gesture can become a microaggression. We're at the point in which people that lecture on universities have to give trigger warnings to minority groups saying, well, in my lecture on history, some things might be mentioned that could offend you. This is crazy. And it's the total opposite of what a university should be, the confrontation with realities and ideas, maybe as a young person, where you're not ready for, but that confrontation is of the essence for normal socialization in society. They attack that idea of freedom and equality. They attack the idea in progress. If everything that we have done in the past have had a bad outcome, then very probably everything that we will do in the future will have a bad outcome as well. Certainly if the dominating group is not cast aside. And I see, of course, in the climate movement very much the woke intoxication. Climate is, of course, a very real problem and we should address it. But the way that this has become a religious way of thinking, where at the end of the day there will be the apocalypse and everybody today has to convert to the right faith. And that's not only being mindful of the climate, but being mindful of everything that wokeism prescribes. They are attacking the idea in progress, which will cost Europe, I think, a bundle in the next generations that are growing up. They rob or they attack every basis in our society that protects us from sheer materialism. If there is no metaphysica anymore that can be defended, the only thing that will be left is physica, material things. The power of imagining a community is being put to zero. The creative power of identity, whether religious or civic, is put to zero. And the only thing that's left, of course, is the creative power of money. And that creative power of money has grown out of hand. I don't think this was the intention of postmodern thinking, but it certainly is the consequence of it. And seventh consequence, seventh point of attack, is of course our geopolitical relevance in the world. If you adopt a way of thinking in which you are the bad guy, then probably everybody else in the world is the good guy. And you see all the splinters in your own eye, but you are prohibited to see anything in the eyes of somebody else. And I cannot help but noticing that for decades now, Europe has missed almost every train that is important in geopolitical politics. We did not see what happened in Islam. We did not see what happened in China. We didn't even see what Vladimir Putin was up to, although it was pretty obvious. If you look at yourself in a black mirror and you are forced to look at the rest of the world in a golden mirror, then you miss out on quite a lot. So in conclusion, I think polarization in Western democracies is real. And I think extremism is a very real danger. And the paralyzation of Western democracies, like in the United States, is even an imminent danger. And therefore, I've wrote that book to force progressive politicians and journalists and people in the cultural world to look in the mirror and to realize that postmodern thinking, wokeism, isn't the solution, but it is part of the problem. And that in that polarization, it does take two to tango, and they are the dance partner of extreme right. Extreme right does not fuel on normality, it fuels on wokeism. And wokeism is not the logical consequence of modernity, it goes against modernity. Wokeism has given up our belief in universalism, our belief in human progress, and our belief in true equality thinking. And therefore, I think it must be combated. I plea for the return to the values on which the modern nation-states were founded and on which they have grown. I hold a plea for the return to true tolerance. I hold a plea for inclusive citizenship. Citizenship that can carry an eternal changing identity, but nevertheless can keep a society, a samenleving, recognizable, can keep it together. It's like, this is my final words, Assita, like the ship of Theseus. If you know the story, he left with that ship on his wonderful journey, many adventures, and everything on his ship was changed. Every wood, every nail, every sail on his journey was replaced, but the ship still was recognizable for everybody who was on it. All the passengers saw it as the instrumental vehicle that would get them through the journey. A ship that does not go or does not know where it's going, even the best wind will not carry it home. I think that wokeism has put us on that very bad course, and that we need to return to Theseus' ship. I thank you very much for your attention.